Before we delve into the quiet story of a town on the brink, let us understand the essential mechanism that saved it. That mechanism is gratitude. Gratitude is not merely an emotion, it is an active state of being, a profound shift in perspective that reorients our inner world. We often mistake it for something we offer after a good event, but its truest power lies in its ability to precede and magnetize positivity. To practice gratitude is to choose to focus on the abundance present in our lives, even amidst challenge, rather than dwelling on scarcity. It acts as a lens, clarifying the countless micro-blessings we take for granted, the strength in our bodies, the loyalty of a friend, the shelter over our heads, or the simple comfort of a warm drink. This intentional recognition of the good is what opens the paths for better things to arrive. When we operate from a place of appreciation, we become more resilient, more creative, and more receptive. We stop seeing obstacles as personal attacks and start seeing them as opportunities for growth. This positive frequency naturally attracts new, helpful connections and draws our attention to opportunities that were always there, but previously obscured by a clouded, complaining mind. Gratitude is the universal key to unlock hope, not because it changes the reality of our circumstances, but because it fundamentally changes the reality within us. It teaches us that happiness isn't a destination, it's the conscious recognition of the journey. Embrace it daily and watch the doors to a richer, more hopeful life swing wide open. Listen closely. Have you ever felt the weight of something fading? Not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but the slow, quiet erosion of hope, like sand slipping through cupped hands? That was the sound of Port Blossom, a town built on the meticulous, rhythmic beauty of clockwork, winding down. Its gears were grinding, not because the craft was lost, but because the spirit was. Our story starts not with a bang, but with a hush, the sound of an old man, Elias, sighing, a sound louder than the rustle of the sea wind through the empty factory windows. Elias was the last master watchmaker at the great Port Blossom clock factory, a magnificent soot-stained cathedral of industry. For 100 years, the factory churned out the world's most precise mechanisms, timekeepers that traveled oceans, and graced the finest halls. But progress is relentless, and Port Blossom's bespoke, hand-finished clocks were now quaint antiques against the sterile, instantaneous efficiency of digital time. Elias looked at Elara, his apprentice, a woman in her late 20s with hands far too fine and a spirit far too bright for the gloom she inherited. She was hunched over the main factory ledger, the numbers colder and harder than the brass components she was used to working with. The factory was not just losing money, it was hemorrhaging morale. People still came to work, but their movements were slow, burdened, and silent. They didn't greet each other. They didn't exchange tips. They simply completed their tasks. Assembly line workers fitting gears, polishers dulling the silver, engineers checking schematics. But the precision was gone, replaced by resignation. Elias's sigh was a reminder of the silence. "They're closing the machine shop, Elara," he whispered, the sound catching in the air like a piece of dust illuminated by a single shaft of weak afternoon sun. "Mr. Thorne sent the memo this morning. Another 20 jobs gone by the end of the month. They say they'll keep the lights on for another quarter, maybe 6 months at most, just to clear inventory, then it's done." Port Blossom stops ticking. Elara didn't look up, but her jaw clenched. She knew. She had seen the vacant stare in the eyes of the workers, the way they avoided each other's gaze. It wasn't just the factory closing, it was the entire town's identity shutting down. The grand clock tower, the one that stood sentinel on the highest hill overlooking the harbour, was the final monumental symbol. Its mechanism, a glorious tangle of bronze and steel that Elias and his father and his grandfather before him had maintained, had begun to fail. A deep, discordant clang would sometimes interrupt the regular, reassuring chime, a mechanical hiccup that sounded like the tower itself choking on grief. The townspeople had stopped hearing the regular chimes months ago. They only noticed the clang. They had lost the ability to recognize the consistent, background rhythm of stability. That's when the idea struck Elara, not like a bright flash, but like a tiny, insistent tick in the dark. It wasn't a business plan. It wasn't a plea for investment. It was an acknowledgement. She looked away from the cold ledger and pulled out a small forgotten project from the bottom of her workbench. It was an old complex clock movement, intricate beyond belief, housed in a mahogany case no bigger than a large book. It was broken in a way that wasn't about time. The mainspring was fine, the escapement was perfect, but the hands wouldn't move beyond the 12-hour mark. Elara had tried for months to fix it, believing it needed a new gear or a tighter jewel bearing. But today, she saw it differently. It didn't need fixing, it needed repurposing. She carefully, meticulously began dismantling the interior. She removed the hour and minute hands, leaving only the central axis. Then, she carved a tiny, delicate hand out of polished copper, a hand shaped like a sprouting leaf. She removed the 12-hour markings and replaced them with a single, deeply engraved word: momentum. She wasn't building a time clock, she was building an acknowledgement clock. Over the next few days, Elara worked in secret. She spent her lunch breaks not at her workbench, but wandering through the factory, the warehouses, the docks, and the quiet streets of Port Blossom. She wasn't looking for heroes or grand gestures. She was looking for consistency, for the small, unnoticed acts of dedication that kept the town from falling apart entirely. The first entry in her secret gratitude ledger wasn't for Elias, the master. It was for Ms. Periwinkle, the cleaner on the 3rd floor of the factory, who, despite knowing she was likely losing her job, still took the time every morning to water the small, struggling potted geranium she'd placed on a forgotten window ledge. It was a defiant act of hope in a place that had given up. Elara wrote, Ms. Periwinkle, 3rd floor, for tending the geranium. A single life preserved, a small green promise against the grey. The second entry was for Finn, the young security guard who always made sure the factory cat, Barnaby, had fresh milk and a warm blanket, even when the heating was cut back. Finn, security gate. For kindness to the voiceless. His duty extends beyond the clock-in. The third was for Mr. Silas, a metal stamper who had been passed over for a promotion years ago and now worked with quiet resentment. But Elara noticed that every single piece he stamped, even the rejected ones, was filed down to a perfect, non-scratch edge before being discarded, a pointless, beautiful act of professional pride. Mr. Silas, Stamping Bay, for perfect edges on discards, integrity that doesn't require an audience. She didn't share the ledger yet. Instead, she started leaving tiny handwritten notes. On Miss Periwinkle's window ledge, she placed a note beside the geranium. Thank you for the green. On Finn's desk, tucked under the cat's bowl, a card. Barnaby sends his regards to the kindest man in Port Blossom. On Mr. Silas's toolbox, a slip of paper. Your edges are the sharpest things left in this factory. Thank you for your precision. The reactions were subtle at first. Miss Periwinkle looked around suspiciously, then touched the geranium, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. Finn, upon reading the card, blinked rapidly, cleared his throat, and spent the rest of his shift standing a little straighter. Mr. Silas, the man who hadn't smiled in 5 years, picked up the note, read it twice, and then slipped it into the breast pocket of his coveralls right over his heart. The following day, Elara brought the mahogany clock back to the factory. She placed it on the wall in a rarely used hallway, a place where people paused on their way to the break room or the loading bay. It was beautiful, warm, and strange. It had no numbers, only the word momentum, and a small leaf-shaped hand pointing vaguely towards the 10 o'clock position. Attached to it was a small, ornate brass plaque that read, The Gratitude Clock. It tracks not hours, but the collective weight of acknowledged effort. Next to the clock, she pinned a large piece of velvet fabric and supplied a box of small, elegantly cut brass labels and a fine-point engraving tool. She didn't write instructions. She simply let it sit. The workers were confused. Some sneered. More of Elara's foolishness. Someone muttered, What's the point of a clock that doesn't tell time? The first real change came from old Elias. He found Elara's entry in the secret ledger and saw how she had tracked his own quiet acts. The time he spent lubricating the old crane that hadn't been used in months just in case, or the 2 hours he'd spent fixing a junior engineer's coffee machine because he knew she needed it more than he needed rest. He realized he was seen. He saw Elara's tiny copper hand slowly nudge forward on the momentum dial, and he was moved. That afternoon, a small, highly polished brass label appeared on the velvet board next to the gratitude clock. In slightly shaky but elegant script, it read, "To Finn, for the dignity he grants Barnaby. His true uniform is compassion. E." It wasn't a big thing, but the fact that the grumpy, respected Master Elias had taken the time to engrave a public recognition for the quiet security guard sent a tremor through the factory floor. People stopped to look. Finn was standing nearby, pretending to check a door lock, his face turning a deep, surprised scarlet. The next day, 2 more labels appeared. One was simple. "Thank you, Mr. Silas, for the perfectly flat surface on my new workbench. It makes all the difference. J." The other was more abstract. "To the person who always restocks the sugar bowl with the tiny tongs, not just the spoon. Small care, big comfort. Anonymous." The copper leaf on the gratitude clock crept forward to the 1 o'clock position. It was slow. It was awkward. But it was genuine. What Elara had understood was that in a time of despair, people don't need promises of salvation. They need confirmation that their struggle, their quiet dedication still matters, that they are not invisible. The tide began to turn, not in profits, but in tiny, tangible ways. The workers started talking. "Did you see what they wrote about Agnes in assembly? About how her gauge checks are always first? I didn't even realize she worked that fast." "Yeah, and old Mr. Jenkins, the custodian, someone finally noticed he fixed the light in the stairwell that's been out for 6 months. No one even asked him to." These small recognitions created pathways. They connected the factory floor to the office, the quiet polisher to the loud mechanic. The simple act of saying thank you for a specific observed effort began to restore a sense of collective ownership. People who had been isolated by despair suddenly realized they were part of a complex, intricate tapestry of mutual reliance. The momentum built. By the time Mr. Thorne, the factory owner, a stern, distant man who lived 3 counties away, arrived for his quarterly inspection, the atmosphere was different. He expected silence, resentment, and barely concealed loathing. Instead, he found a low hum of activity, punctuated by occasional genuine laughter. He found 2 workers arguing heatedly, not over a safety violation, but over whose turn it was to sharpen the communal tool set. Most strangely, he found the gratitude clock. He stood before the velvet board, which was now filled with dozens of engraved brass labels, glinting in the light. He read them all. "To the engineer who caught the decimal error in the shipment order, you saved our month. To the baker, Mrs. Gable, who sneaks extra cinnamon buns into the morning delivery. To the old lighthouse keeper who keeps the foghorn painted a perfect, brilliant white. They weren't just about the factory anymore. They were about the whole town." Mr. Thorne, the man who saw his business only in cold, black ink, felt a sudden sharp ache in his chest. He realized he had been dismantling a community, not just a business. He had only recognized profit and loss. He had never seen the countless micro-victories that kept the whole machine running. He walked into Elara's workshop, the first time he had ever entered the apprentice's space. "Elara," his voice was rough. "Tell me about this thing, this momentum." She explained it simply. "The clock doesn't measure the minutes we work, sir. It measures the connections we acknowledge. Small recognitions create great connections. We were failing not because our clocks were obsolete, but because our connections were." Mr. Thorne left Port Blossom that day, not with an official closure notice, but with a strange, unnerving sense of duty he hadn't felt since his grandfather ran the place. He began to look at his own life, his own company, through the lens of recognition. He started with the 2 people he had always taken most for granted, his elderly, long-suffering personal assistant, who handled every crisis with unflappable grace, and his own son, a young man who had always felt overlooked. A few weeks later, the storm hit. It was called Typhoon Cassandra, and it was a beast, the worst the coast had seen in 50 years. The wind howled. The sea churned into a gray-green froth, and the rain came down in sheets, relentless and blinding. Power lines snapped, roads flooded, and the fear that had been slowly retreating from Port Blossom surged back in full force. The most immediate and critical threat was the Great Clock Tower. Located high on the headland, the wind was tearing at its ancient structure. Elias, watching from the factory floor, now a temporary shelter for displaced families, pointed frantically. The roof is compromised. The mechanism, if the rain gets in, the whole thing seizes, and if that tower goes, the town goes with it. It was a massive job, impossible for just a few, but the people of Port Blossom were no longer isolated individuals waiting for a paycheck. They were a recognized, interconnected network. In the factory's dim emergency lighting, Elara stood by the gratitude clock. The copper leaf was nearly at the 6 o'clock position now, a massive build-up of acknowledged effort. She didn't give orders, she simply called out names based on the skills she knew, not from a resume but from the brass labels. Mr. Silas, your precision filing is perfect. We need small, specific metal braces for the roof anchors. Can you manage a team on the fly? Mr. Silas, the resentful, quiet stamper, straightened up. I'll do it. Give me Finn. He's sharp. He'll spot the structural weaknesses. The security guard, recognized for his compassion, now recognized for his sharp eye, immediately gathered his small crew. Agnes, your hands are the fastest and steadiest in the assembly line. We need you and your team to quickly apply waterproof sealant to the most exposed joins. Finn will guide you on where to go. Agnes, the quiet assembly worker, didn't hesitate. We'll need Ms. Periwinkle's cleaning cloths. They're the strongest for drying surfaces. The cleaner, acknowledged for caring for a single geranium, was now an essential part of the rescue effort, mobilizing her supplies. In the blinding rain, under the threatening dark sky, the small, specific acts of recognition transformed into coordinated, powerful action. The baker, recognized for her cinnamon buns, became the logistics expert, coordinating food and blankets. The quiet engineer, whose coffee machine Elias had fixed, used her specific technical knowledge to reroute essential power to the makeshift medical bay. They worked through the night, each person performing their specific, recognized skill, not for money, but for each other. They didn't need grand titles. They needed to know their particular contribution mattered. They were finally moving with momentum. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the great clock tower still stood. Its mechanism was dry, protected by the quick, precise work of the people who had finally recognized the value of each other's quiet, consistent effort. They were exhausted, soaked, and freezing, but as the first rays of weak sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the repaired structure, a collective cheer went up, not of relief, but of triumph. It was the sound of a community finding its rhythm again. 2 days later, Mr. Thorne returned, not in his suit, but in work boots and a rain-stained coat. He had seen the news. He saw the unity. He saw the gratitude clock, the copper leaf finally settled, pointing high. He didn't close the factory. He announced a radical shift. Port Blossom doesn't fail because of digital time, he said to the assembled workers, his voice thick with unaccustomed emotion. Port Blossom fails when we stop seeing the value of the hands that work here. He reopened the machine shop, but with a new mandate. They would no longer attempt to mass-produce cheap, obsolete clocks. They would use the collective, acknowledged skills of their engineers, stampers, and watchmakers to create bespoke, limited edition, monumental timepieces, art installations, custom civic clocks, mechanisms of unparalleled quality that only these specific hands, recognized and valued, could create. The factory would thrive on quality and legacy, not volume. The town was saved not by a miracle but by the simple, powerful act of seeing. Elara's gratitude clock was moved from the quiet hallway to the town square, right beneath the great clock tower. It still had no numbers, only the word momentum and the copper leaf. The velvet board, now a permanent fixture beneath it, became the town's true archive, tracking not hours, but the constant, growing tally of shared life and acknowledged effort. Port Blossom's most important product was no longer its clocks, but its community, perpetually renewed by the understanding that a sincere, specific thank you is the most powerful engine of hope in the world. And that is where we leave Port Blossom, not just ticking, but singing, its gears meshing perfectly, powered by recognition, hope, and the undeniable truth that small acknowledgements create the largest, most resilient human connections. If you love this story and want to hear more like it, please hit that subscribe button. It truly means the world to us and helps us grow. And hey, while you're at it, let's aim for 50 likes on this video. Help us smash that goal.